Good morning, this is Alicia Sharabali.
And I'm Zach Kotz.
Welcome to the Global Current.
First up in the news, staffer Itayu Ikanji reports on the death of Lady Margaret Thatcher and her controversial legacy.
I will not change just to court popularity.
Britain loses its Iron Lady. Former British Prime Minister, Iron Lady Margaret Thatcher, has died. The Iron Lady breathed her last on the morning of April 18, 2013, at the Ritz Hotel in London. According to the Daily Telegraph, Thatcher had resided in the hotel since Christmas due to physical limitations that prevented her from living in her Chester Square home. Even in death, Thatcher has remained deeply a divisive figure. Many despise her political legacy, while still remaining deeply loved by those who subscribe to her philosophy. As Dan Rivers of CNN noted, one thing is for certain, the Iron Lady's place in history is assured. As news of her death spread, world leaders have taken their turns paying tribute to Thatcher's memory. In his own tribute, U.S. President Barack Obama stated, "America has lost a true friend." As a grocer's daughter who rose to become Britain's first female prime minister, she stands as an example to her daughters that there is no glass ceiling that can be shattered. President Obama hearkened to Britain's close partnership during Thatcher's time in office, acknowledging that she knew that with strength and resolve, we could win the Cold War and extend freedom's promise. According to Bloomberg, Thatcher will be remembered for her strong convictions on conservative economic policies, which she introduced to Britain before it became popular in other nations. Thatcher implemented privatization and deregulation policies amid strong resistance from critics, mainly the British labor unions. Britain's Daily Mail remembered Margaret Thatcher as the woman who saved Britain. Yet, others look away from her economic policies to find fault. As Prime Minister, Thatcher refused to join other nations in sanctioning the apartheid regime in South Africa, instead insisting on her policy of constructive engagement. To Lady Thatcher, Nelson Mandela and his fellow ANC members were little more than a typical terrorist organization. Thatcher's legacy also includes going to war with Argentina over the Falklands Islands in 1982, as well as her overwhelming support for the First Gulf War. Although Thatcher was out of office by the time coalition forces invaded Iraq, she used her public image to garner support for the U.S. President George H.W. Bush. Critics of the Iron Lady have criticized her policies by pointing to the high unemployment rate during her reign as Prime Minister. Many critics accuse the Iron Lady of being a divisive politician who polarized the nation and its people against each other. The Daily Mirror splashed across its front page a picture of Lady Thatcher under the headline, "The Woman Who Divided a Nation," arguing that Margaret Thatcher broke Britain and replaced it with something crueler and nastier. To some, Margaret Thatcher was Britain's greatest advocate. To many others, she spent 11 years fighting against Britain itself. Downing Street has said that more than 700 armed forces personnel drawn from all three services will take part in the funeral services for Lady Thatcher. Though in accordance with her wishes, no military firepass will mark the service. Thatcher's coffin will be carried into St. Paul's Cathedral by bearers from units particularly associated with the Falklands War. As one of the Cold War's most iconic and controversial figures is laid to rest, both critics and admirers of the Iron Lady agree Margaret Thatcher leaves behind a legacy of policies that, for better or for worse, changed Britain's political landscape forever. It's been Itayu Ikanji for the Global Current.
Up next, Brittany Little on the inauguration of Kenya's newest president amidst criminal allegations.
I assume as President of the Republic of Kenya do swear that I will be faithful
and bear true allegiance to the Republic of Kenya
and bear true allegiance to the Republic of Kenya.
The new president of Kenya has taken office amidst a cloud of legal allegations. Uhuru Kenyatta, known primarily as the son of Kenya's first president, was sworn into presidency on April 9th despite his impending July trial date with the ICC. Kenyatta was elected back in March. His role in the widespread violence that enveloped Kenya after its 2007 presidential elections remains fresh in the minds of the population. After Kenya's last presidential election nearly 5 years ago, allegations against Kenyatta emerged, culminating in his being charged with crimes relating to human rights abuses and inter-ethnic issues. Although Kenyatta is only the fourth president in Kenya's history, he is the second president that has taken the office of presidency while facing legal charges. Kenyatta's inauguration poses an even bigger challenge for the International Criminal Court, which is now faced with limitations posed by the right of sovereign immunity. Among the pomp and circumstance of his inauguration, many distinguished guests, including Western diplomats, were joined by thousands of Kenyans who flocked to Nairobi from all over the country to witness the event, piling into a soccer stadium in order to view the inauguration ceremony. Many guests were shocked when Yoweri Museveni, the president of Uganda, gave a speech on behalf of all the presidents in attendance in which he congratulated the Kenyan population for finally making the right choice by electing Kenyatta. At only 51 years of age, Kenyatta will have plenty of energy to dedicate himself fully to tending to Kenya's desperate needs. As soon as he was sworn in, Kenyatta began making promises to promote relationships with the international world and keep peace across Kenya's many ethnic borders. Kenyatta further declared his optimism during a speech, stating, quote, "I assure you again that under my leadership, Kenya will strive to uphold our international obligations so long as they are founded on the well-established principles of mutual respect and reciprocity." Kenyatta is facing charges of crimes against humanity for allegedly helping organize post-election ethnic violence in nearly 2008 that killed more than 1,100 people and displaced 600,000 others. Kenyatta has been charged along with his deputy, William Ruto. The trial is set to begin in July. It's Brittany Little with the Global.Current.
Finally in the news, staffer Arjun Donde updates us on a deadly new strain of bird flu in China.
A new strain of bird flu known as H7N9 has been discovered in China, placing the Southeast Asian nation at the epicenter of a global health epidemic once again. To date, there have been 28 confirmed cases of a new strain of bird flu. The death toll, which shows no sign of abating, currently stands confirmed at 9.
As for this new H7N9 bird flu virus that we have discovered, up until now we are certain that it is a completely new flu virus that had infected humans. As of now, we are still unclear on where the infection originated from, and we are unclear as to what specific types of animals had infected them.
Chinese and World Health Organization authorities have yet to discover any case of H7N9 with human-to-human transmission. Due to fears of the flu originating from contact with avian species, the Chinese government has responded to the outbreak at the source. According to CNN, in Shanghai province, more than 100,000 live birds have been killed in the past week at live poultry markets across the city in an effort to contain the problem. China has begun work on an H7N9 vaccine. However, some experts doubt the readiness at which any such vaccine will become available due to the complexity of the new strain, forecasting that a vaccine will likely not be available for widespread use for some time. This new flu has begun to affect the local economy. In addition to the slaughter of poultry in live markets across the country, many cities in China and Hong Kong have now suspended the trading of live birds until the virus can be controlled. Despite these precautions, the WHO has stated that no strands of the virus have been found in any other livestock. The Chinese government is not taking any risks. Chinese inspectors in Hong Kong and on the mainland have begun inspecting meat being shipped in and around China, and many cities in China have banned the trade of meat products to prevent the spread of this virus. The WHO has offered a possible reason behind the spread of the virus. They believe that it is due to family clusters. These clusters act as areas for the virus to spread from person to person. Despite this theory, the WHO has stated that citizens should not panic. The relatively low fatality rate is being taken as a signal that the epidemic may soon pass. Arjun Donde, Global.Current.
Moving on to commentary, Stephanie Siegel recalls the forgotten plight of the North Korean civilian population.
The United Nations Human Rights Council Special Rapporteur on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, has called for a thorough investigation into North Korea's human rights violations.
In particular, subparagraphs A, murder, C, enslavement, E, imprisonment or other severe deprivation of physical liberty in violation of fundamental rules of international law, F, torture, H, persecution against any identifiable group or collectivity on political and religious grounds, I, enforced disappearances of persons, and K, other inhumane acts of a similar character, intentionally causing great suffering or serious injury to body or to mental or physical health.
There is a worldwide acknowledgement of North Korea's concentration camps, which are used to punish those who articulate even the mildest dissent. The DPRK's imprisonment policies even include incarcerating the family of the alleged dissident. Anyone sent to a DPRK concentration camp not only serves a life sentence, but condemns their descendants for 2 additional generations to a life sentence inside the camp. The North Korean representative to the United Nations has adamantly denied all of the charges against DPRK.
The copy of faked material on the human rights situation of my country, fabricated and invented by the hostile forces, defectors, and other rebels. It is nothing more than an instrument of political plot aimed at sabotaging my socialist system by defaming the dignified image of DPRK and creating an atmosphere of international pressure.
In the midst of all of the rhetoric that has been coming from North Korea, what is missing is the reality that the real threat is to the 24 million North Koreans residing in the state. 25% of North Korea's children are chronically malnourished, and their lack of proper nutrition is leading to severe developmental delays. Barbara Demnick, Beijing bureau chief for the Los Angeles Times, says, quote, "A South Korean teenager, 18-year-old male, is about 5 inches taller than his North Korean counterpart, and there are many soldiers who are only 4 foot 6 inches tall. The height requirement is supposed to be 4'9", but they can't find enough people who are that big. The situation is very desperate." 2/3 of North Koreans have no idea where their next meal will come from, and 10% of 2-year-olds are predicted to experience severe developmental delays because of acute malnourishment. The irony of this repression is the cost to the DPRK's human capital. As the prevalence of food shortages continues to rise, North Korea will become increasingly unable to maintain a viable economy, both at present and for generations to come. While lauding itself as a strong and sustainable state, DPRK is crippling its most valuable resource, its citizens. The contrast between North Korea and South Korea is becoming more distinct. The small numbers of defectors that make their way to South Korea are finding integration difficult. Children from the DPRK who are able to get to South Korea lag far behind their peers, both physically and developmentally, and require special supplementation for their schooling. Demnick says, quote, "It's frightening to think about more sanctions. When I've met North Koreans in China, they've said to me, 'You have no idea how difficult our lives are. We live like dogs.' They wake up in the morning wondering what they're going to eat for dinner. They go to bed at night wondering what they're going to find for breakfast. And this is a situation that's been chronic for 20 years. Decades of authoritarian control and draconian measures has come at a high cost. As the United States speculates on the truth of North Korea's claims of nuclear action, it is imperative to remember that the DPRK's disregard for the lives of their own citizens stands as a horrific reality for the 24 million people." Stephanie Siegel, The Global.Current.
Next, staffer Matt Giordano weighs in.
Last month, the Global.Current reported on the situation in Mali, indicating that France will have to commit large amounts of resources and time in the country to battle the ongoing terrorist threats. This week's report is an update on this situation and a further analysis into the conflict. In the last segment, we learned that the conflict began due to rebel forces launching an attack on the interim government and occupying several strategic cities. The rebels demanded autonomy for the north, which they called Azawad. However, in their endeavor to gain independence, they recruited various Islamic fundamentalist factions to assist in their cause. Of these factions, the MUJAO and the AQIM are the two most well-known for their hostage-taking and killing of foreigners. Since our last report, the rebel forces and terrorist factions have gone their separate ways, with the majority of the fighting focused between the rebels and the Islamic factions. Once France and the African-led International Security Monitoring Group, or AFI-SMA, deployed military units to Mali, The rebels publicly announced that they were willing to work alongside the Malian government and France to eradicate the terrorists from the north. As was previously predicted on the Global Current, the UN has yet to make any substantial decisions regarding Mali or a UN peacekeeping force there. The Security Council is probably waiting until the violence decreases long enough for the rebel forces and the interim government to sign a peace negotiation. Therefore, no one should expect to see a resolution coming out of the UN anytime soon. The French, however, have been taking the lead in training the Malian forces in eradicating the remaining terrorists. These jobs should be left to the AFI-SMA units, who so far have incurred the highest number of casualties since securing the cities taken by the Islamic factions. The AFI-SMA units are more psychologically and culturally close to the Malian military and therefore better positioned for training operations, while the French military is better positioned to focus their attention on the terrorist factions. If France is not able to concentrate their attention to the areas they are best suited to resolve, they could stretch their resources too thin and not provide a strong enough blow to the terrorists. If AFI-SMA continues to incur the highest casualties, they will lose credibility with ECOWAS and their deployment forces. AFI-SMA, therefore, is better suited for training missions. ECOWAS has been taking the lead on peace negotiations between the rebels and the Malian interim government. This is the component that the UN should be assisting in, deploying more classical peacekeeping forces to mediate a negotiation, and then deploying a monitoring and observing presence in order to oversee the enforcement of the negotiation. The UN can also assist in civilian operations by stabilizing the government in order to combat that issue that started the conflict in the first place: ineffective governance. It will not be until these actions take place in Mali that we will see a significant change in its prospects. First, there will have to be a peace negotiation settled by mediation through ECOWAS, and perhaps a UN peacekeeping force. Then the AFI-SMA unit should train the Malian military, disarm rebels and reintegrate them into the national forces, while France should work alongside the trained and well-equipped Malian forces to eradicate the terrorist factions in the north. This is Matt Giordano for the Global Current.
Finally, executive producer Laura Toledo speaks with Dr. George Ogola, a senior lecturer in journalism for the University of Central Lancashire in England, on the controversy surrounding the election of new Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta.
Thank you so much to agreeing to speak with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
The last Kenyan presidential election in 2007 plunged the country into chaos and violence. While there have been some reports of clashes after the vote earlier this month, activity has by and large been much more calm. What do you think helped make this change?
We have to explain it on different factors. We can't attribute it to one single factor. The first, of course, the fact that, many Kenyans were quite shocked by what happened in 2007-8. And very few people wanted a repeat of the violence that occurred during the last time. Second, of course, is the fact that the country has a fairly reformed judiciary, and people are aware that the days of impunity were gone. So if you were to commit a crime, you would most certainly be taken to court. Third, of course, was the ICC process. The fact that some of the most powerful politicians in Kenya were indicted, by the ICC did, in fact, mean that, potential funders of violence or participants feared what would happen to them. So it is, the peaceful elections could be attributed to a number of factors.
International news outlets have focused on the charges brought against Uhuru Kenyatta and his running mate, William Ruto, by the International Criminal Court, as you mentioned. How has local media covered these charges in Kenya?
First is the fact we've got to recognize that, the ICC process has polarized the country politically. So there were those who used the process of what was happening to Uhuru and Ruto to sort of whip up what I would describe as sort of anti-Western rhetoric, or the anti-colonial sort of rhetoric to galvanize people against, Raila Odinga, who was perceived to be a leader that was supposed to be imposed on Kenyans by the Western world. So there are a number of sort of news organizations that are tempted to frame, the debate in that sense. But there's also a very powerful civil society that used this process at the very, to attempt to privilege, discussions or discourse around the need for political accountability. So you had those two different sort of positions being taken by various media. I think that's how I would possibly characterize the coverage of the ICC process by the local media.
Okay, so what form of media does the general public in Kenya have access to? Is it the state-run television station, or what is kind of the more popular method for them to get their news?
The private media is much more trusted. I mean, the state media does have sort of national reach rather, but it's because of its history, it's not trusted as much, and it's not considered very reliable. So private media, so you all have these sort of different media targeting, for instance, perhaps different regions or different ethnic constituencies. Although there are also those that have and sort of what I would consider national audience to be fair.
Okay, and how are elections covered by the Kenyan press? Is it sort of like a horse race, like here in the U.S. media, or do things get a little more into the issues, or how are elections and politics generally covered in Kenya?
Right, the more dominant sort of media organizations tend to focus relatively on issues. But again, issues in Kenya are very much sort of personalized. So it's still the coverage is still very, very much defined by particular individuals. So it's not so much they don't focus so much on sort of the ideological positions of particular candidates. They tend to focus more often on personalities and the histories of those particular personalities. But there's also this key problem about ownership, which is a massive, massive problem. The fact that some of these media actually are also owned by politicians. So they tend to, at election time, they tend to reflect the voices of those particular politicians rather than, focusing on specific issues to determine, who wins an election. There's usually a lot of sort of vested interests, personal and political sort of interlocking, particularly at election time. So, it's not so much a question of them focusing on issues. Usually, it's more a question of them, covertly representing the interests of particular individuals, although these are sometimes narrated as though they are focusing on issues, and it's something that has happened for quite a long time, despite sort of media liberalization. That has not quite changed.
Moving on to the International Criminal Court and the charges there, the Kenyan Parliament voted in 2010 to withdraw from the Rome Statute, the treaty that established the ICC. Will this make it more difficult to try him?
I don't think it will. In any case, the ICC has not, for instance, argued that they will need Uhuru to be at The Hague, as a person, or in person rather. So I'm not particularly sure that it's going to make any difference in terms of determining the legal process. It could perhaps affect the way the ICC presents its case, in the sense that they might not be able to perhaps have access to witnesses, especially those that have perhaps promised to speak against the accused. So that might be a potential problem. But I don't think that Uhuru's election is going to determine whether he is found guilty or otherwise, or that it's going to fundamentally redefine the way the ICC sort of conducts its business. I think that will stay. What remains to be seen is what happens, if in the event that he's found guilty, what is it that the ICC is actually going to do? That is what you can be certain. Is he going to remain president? Is it going to perhaps trigger not really a revolution, but some protest from within the country that could ultimately render his government illegitimate? I really don't know. But insofar as the ICC process is concerned, I don't think his presidency is going to change anything.
Okay, and did Raila Odinga use these charges at the ICC in the election against Kenyatta and his running mate Ruto? Was that brought up?
He did bring it up, especially sort of at the formative stages of the campaign. But I think Ruto and Uhuru were perhaps very clever in turning the process over its head. They actually turned the fact that they'd been accused by an organization that does not, to be fair, does not have much credibility in certain parts of Kenya, because of Africa for that matter, because there are a number of people who have argued for a number of reasons that the ICC is a Western tool variously used by powerful powerful Western states to punish African leaders that they don't like. It's a very complicated and problematic argument, but it does very easily stir up the anti-Western sentiments, and Uhuru and Kenyatta sort of used that, as I mentioned before, to sort of galvanize local support, for their own candidacy. So Raila did realize that it wasn't working for his benefit. So although in the formative stages of the campaign he did use it quite a bit, he dropped it. Indeed, in the presidential debate, he made sure that Kenyans were aware that of his intentions were he to be president. He said that he would ensure that the cases were brought back home, so that these two were actually tried by Kenyan courts and not at the ICC. But his admission, that admission did in fact underline the fact that he realized that Uhuru and Ruto had used that ICC process to mobilize people around their cause.
Do you think that this peace journalism culture has also contributed to the impunity that the Ocampo Six and Uhuru and Ruto are not facing kind of more broad criticism for their involvement in the violence in 2007?
Very much so. The peace journalism will have to, and I'm hopeful that the media will take time to, as I say, self-appraise, because peace journalism is killing, say, investigative journalism in Kenya. It's destroying a political culture that had just begun to emerge. The media has a role, and I think it must not confuse that role. It has a role to act as the fourth estate, to hold, politicians to account. It must not act as a politician, and I think the media has been confusing this role. It's upon sort of media owners and editors to actually understand that the democratization process will only be successful if the media continues to play its role.
Absolutely. Well, I wanted to thank you so much for joining us today on the Global Current. It was a pleasure to speak with you, and though you say you have a lot of opinions, they seem to make a lot of sense.
No, thank you very much for having me.
And that's all for this week's show. I'm Alicia Sharabali.
And I'm Zach Kotz. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to check us out online at blogs.shu.edu/globalcurrent. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We'll see you next week.